In the chaos of war, heroes often hide in plain sight. Sometimes they wear uniforms that fool everyone around them. Sometimes they save lives with one hand while taking them with the other. This is the story of Maria Santos, a 23-year-old battlefield nurse whose gentle touch could heal wounds and whose deadly aim could end conflicts. For months, enemy forces terrorized a small village, believing victory was certain. The local militia was losing hope. Medical supplies were running low, and death seemed to lurk around every corner. But what they didn't know was that their salvation had been walking among them all along, disguised as the quiet young woman who bandaged their wounds and whispered words of comfort. When the final battle arrived, and all seemed lost, Maria would reveal a secret that would change everything. This is the true story of how a healer became a warrior, and how sometimes the most unlikely person can turn the tide of history. Maria Santos had always been different from other girls in the village of San Miguel. While her friends played with dolls and dreamed of marriage, she spent her afternoons helping Dr. Rodriguez in the small clinic at the edge of town. Her fingers moved with unusual precision as she cleaned wounds and prepared bandages. There was something almost magical about the way she could calm a crying child or ease the pain of an injured farmer. The year was 1943, and the war had finally reached their quiet corner of the mountains. Enemy forces had been advancing for months, taking village after village with brutal efficiency. San Miguel sat strategically at the crossroads of three important supply routes, making it a valuable target. The villagers knew it was only a matter of time before the fighting reached their doors. Maria was 23 years old, with dark hair that she always kept neatly braided, and kind brown eyes that seemed to see right through people's pain. She had been working as a nurse for 5 years, ever since Dr. Rodriguez noticed her natural talent for healing during a flu outbreak. The old doctor had no children of his own, and he treated Maria like the daughter he never had. When the first wounded soldiers arrived in San Miguel, Maria was ready. The local militia had established a small defense force, but they were poorly equipped and undertrained. Most were farmers and shopkeepers who had never held a rifle before the war began. Their leader, Captain Torres, was a former police officer who did his best to prepare the men for what was coming. The makeshift hospital was set up in the old school building. Maria worked around the clock, moving from patient to patient with quiet efficiency. She seemed to be everywhere at once, checking bandages, administering medicine, and offering words of comfort to scared young soldiers who were far from home. What nobody knew was that Maria had been preparing for this moment her entire life. As a child, her grandfather had taught her to shoot. He was a veteran of earlier conflicts and believed that everyone should know how to defend themselves. While other children played games, Maria practiced with an old hunting rifle behind their house. Her grandfather was amazed by her natural ability. She could hit targets that experienced hunters missed, and she never seemed to get nervous under pressure. Her grandfather also taught her about patience and observation. During their hunting trips in the mountains, he showed her how to read the landscape, how to find the best positions, and how to remain invisible even when enemies were searching for you. These lessons seemed like games at the time, but Maria absorbed every detail. When her grandfather died, Maria was 15. She kept his old rifle hidden in her room, along with his military medals and the faded photographs of his unit. She continued to practice in secret, hiking into the mountains alone to maintain her skills. She told herself it was just a way to remember him, but deep down she knew she was preparing for something. The fighting grew closer each week. Reports came in of other villages falling to the enemy advance. Refugees arrived daily with stories of brutal attacks and mass executions. The enemy was known for showing no mercy to civilians who resisted. They were particularly harsh toward anyone who helped the local militia. Captain Torres did his best to organize the defense, but resources were limited. They had perhaps 50 men with working rifles and very little ammunition. The enemy force approaching them was estimated at over 200 well-equipped soldiers with artillery support. The odds were impossible. Maria watched the preparations with growing concern. She saw the fear in the militiamen's eyes and the hopelessness in Captain Torres's voice during his planning meetings. Rodriguez was making arrangements to evacuate the hospital patients, but they both knew there wasn't enough time or transportation for everyone. One evening, while changing bandages on a young soldier named Roberto, Maria overheard him talking to his friend about their desperate situation. Roberto had been shot in the shoulder during a scouting mission and was lucky to escape alive. He described seeing enemy positions and counting their weapons. "They have machine gun nests on both hills," Roberto whispered. "Our boys will be slaughtered if they try a direct attack. There's no way we can win this fight." His friend nodded grimly. "Captain Torres knows it too. He's just trying to buy time for the civilians to escape." Maria continued her work silently, but her mind was racing. She thought about her grandfather's lessons and the skills she had developed over the years. She thought about the people she had healed and the community she loved. An idea began to form in her mind, dangerous but possible. That night, after the hospital had grown quiet, Maria slipped away to her small apartment above the bakery where she lived. She retrieved her grandfather's rifle from its hiding place and examined it carefully. The weapon was old but well-maintained. She had kept it clean and oiled over the years, more out of habit than any specific plan. She also gathered other items her grandfather had left her: a pair of military binoculars, a compass, and detailed maps of the surrounding mountains. Looking at these objects, Maria felt her grandfather's presence and remembered his words about courage and duty. The next few days passed in a blur of medical duties and secret preparation. Maria continued her nursing work during the day, but spent her evenings studying the terrain around San Miguel. She memorized every trail, every rock formation, and every possible hiding spot in the mountains above the village. She also began observing the enemy positions more carefully. Using her grandfather's binoculars, she could see their camps in the distance and count their sentries. She noticed patterns in their patrol schedules and identified the locations of their most dangerous weapons. Rodriguez noticed that Maria seemed distracted, but he assumed she was simply worried about the approaching battle, like everyone else. He had no idea that his gentle assistant was planning something that would change the course of the fight. The enemy deadline was approaching. They had sent a messenger demanding the village's surrender within 1 week. If the militia laid down their arms and turned over their weapons, the civilians would be spared. If they resisted, everyone would be considered an enemy combatant. Captain Torres called a meeting of all the militiamen and key civilians to discuss their options. The gathering took place in the church, with nearly 100 people crowding into the small building. Maria sat in the back listening carefully as the debate raged. Some argued for surrender, believing it was their only chance to save lives. Others insisted they should fight, even if the cause was hopeless. Captain Torres presented the harsh reality. They were outnumbered 4-1, with inferior weapons and no hope of reinforcements. "We can make them pay for every meter of ground," he said, "but we cannot win this battle through conventional means. If we fight, most of us will die. If we surrender, we become prisoners with no guarantee of fair treatment." An old farmer named Martinez stood up. "What about the women and children? My granddaughter is only 8 years old. What kind of future will she have under enemy occupation?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Everyone knew the stories from other occupied territories. The enemy was not known for showing kindness to conquered populations, especially those who had resisted. Maria felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. She looked around at the faces of people she had known her entire life. The baker who gave her free bread when money was tight. The teacher who had encouraged her education. The children she had treated for scraped knees and fevers. That night, she made her final decision. Maria wrote a letter to Dr. Six Rodriguez explaining that she would be away for a few days on a special mission. She asked him not to worry and promised to return as soon as possible. She sealed the letter and left it on his desk, where he would find it in the morning. Then she gathered her grandfather's equipment and a small bag of supplies. The rifle felt familiar in her hands, like an old friend she hadn't seen in years. She checked the scope alignment and loaded the weapon with practiced movements. Before leaving, Maria knelt beside her bed and said a prayer. She asked for courage, for steady hands, and for the wisdom to know when and how to act. She thought about her grandfather and hoped he would be proud of what she was about to attempt. As the sun rose over San Miguel, Maria Santos began her journey into the mountains. Behind her, the village continued its desperate preparations for siege. Ahead of her lay enemy territory and the most dangerous mission of her life. Nobody suspected that their quiet young nurse was about to become something else entirely. The transformation had been years in the making, But now it was time to reveal who Maria Santos truly was, beneath the gentle exterior. The phantom sniper was about to be born. The mountain trails were treacherous in the early morning darkness, but Maria moved through them like a ghost. Years of childhood exploration had given her an intimate knowledge of every path and hiding place. She knew which rocks would hold her weight and which branches would snap underfoot. Her grandfather's training had taught her to move silently, leaving no trace of her passage. By sunrise, she had reached her first observation point, a rocky outcrop that provided a clear view of the enemy's main camp. Through her binoculars, Maria counted approximately 200 soldiers spread across 3 separate areas. The main force was positioned in a valley below, with smaller units controlling the high ground on either side. She spent the entire morning studying their movements and routines. The enemy was well organized and disciplined, but they were also confident to the point of carelessness. They had established a perimeter, but their sentries seemed more concerned with looking toward the village than watching the mountains behind them. Maria identified several key targets: the commanding officers who gathered each morning for briefings, the machine gun crews that posed the greatest threat to any village defense, and the artillery teams that could shell San Miguel from a distance. She also noticed something that would prove crucial later: a communications tent where radio operators maintained contact with other enemy units. What struck her most was how young many of the soldiers looked. Some appeared to be barely 18 years old, probably drafted from farms and factories far from this mountain battlefield. She felt a pang of sadness knowing that war turned young men into killers, and that her actions might send some of them home in boxes. But then she thought about Roberto lying wounded in the hospital, about 8-year-old Martinez's granddaughter, and about all the people counting on someone to protect them. Her resolve hardened. Maria spent that first day learning the enemy's patterns. She watched their patrol schedules, meal times, and shift changes. She noted which positions offered the best fields of fire and which escape routes would be safest after taking a shot. Most importantly, she identified the psychological impact points, targets whose elimination would create maximum confusion and demoralization. That evening, as darkness fell over the mountains, Maria made her way to her first shooting position. She had selected a spot roughly 800 meters from the enemy camp, far beyond the range of their rifles but well within her own capabilities. Her grandfather's old hunting rifle had been modified years ago with an excellent scope, and Maria had maintained both weapon and optics in perfect condition. The position itself was a natural fortress, a cluster of large boulders that provided concealment from multiple angles while offering a clear view of the target area. Maria had discovered it during her teenage hunting expeditions and always thought it would make an excellent sniper's nest. She settled in to wait, knowing that patience was a sniper's most important virtue. Her grandfather had taught her that hunting was 10% shooting and 90% waiting for the right moment. The same principle applied to hunting men. Around midnight, her opportunity came. A group of officers emerged from the command tent for what appeared to be a late planning session. They gathered around a table with maps and documents, illuminated by several lanterns. One man, clearly the senior commander based on the deference shown by others, stood at the head of the table pointing at various locations on the map. Maria adjusted her scope and controlled her breathing. The distance was significant, and there was a slight crosswind to account for. She had only one shot before her position would be compromised. It had to count. Through the scope, she could see the commander's face clearly. He was perhaps 50 years old, with graying hair and the confident bearing of a career military officer. For a moment, Maria hesitated. This was different from hunting deer or target practice. This was taking a human life. Then she remembered the refugees streaming into San Miguel with stories of burned villages and executed civilians. She thought about Dr. Rodriguez working frantically to treat wounded militiamen with inadequate supplies. She pictured the children who would suffer under enemy occupation. Maria's finger tightened on the trigger. The rifle's report echoed across the mountains like thunder. Through her scope, she saw the commander crumple to the ground. The other officers dove for cover, shouting orders and trying to organize a response. Chaos erupted throughout the camp as soldiers scrambled to identify the source of the shot. But Maria was already moving. She had planned her escape route carefully, and within minutes she was 500 meters away from her firing position. The enemy response was predictable. Troops fanned out in all directions, searching for an attacker they would never find. She spent the rest of the night observing the aftermath from a safe distance. The loss of their commander had clearly shaken the enemy force. Radio communications increased dramatically as subordinates tried to contact higher headquarters for instructions. Patrol patterns became more cautious and defensive. Maria returned to her mountain hideout as dawn broke. She had established a small camp in a cave that was invisible from below and accessible only by a treacherous climbing route. Here she could rest, plan her next move, and monitor enemy activities. The psychological impact of her first shot exceeded her expectations. Through her binoculars, she could see increased security around the command area and more nervous behavior among the sentries. The enemy was learning that they were not as safe as they had assumed. Over the next 3 days, Maria continued her campaign of psychological warfare. She took carefully planned shots at key personnel, always from different positions, and always with immediate escape routes prepared. She eliminated 2 machine gun team leaders, a radio operator, and an artillery spotter. Each shot was followed by hours of fruitless searching by enemy patrols. The cumulative effect was devastating to enemy morale. Soldiers began showing signs of severe stress. They jumped at shadows and fired at imaginary threats. Discipline started to break down as fear spread through the ranks. Some men refused to leave their positions even for necessary duties. Maria varied her tactics to increase the psychological pressure. Sometimes she would fire a single shot and disappear. Other times she would take 2 quick shots from different angles, making it seem like multiple snipers were operating in the area. She also began targeting equipment rather than personnel, destroying radio antennas and ammunition supplies. The enemy response grew increasingly desperate. They brought in tracking dogs, but the Rocky Mountain terrain made it impossible to follow Maria's trail. They tried using flares to illuminate potential hiding spots, but the mountains offered too many possible positions. They even attempted to use their artillery to shell suspected sniper locations, but they were shooting blind at empty rocks. Meanwhile, back in San Miguel, the effects of Maria's campaign were becoming apparent. Captain Torres received reports from his scouts that the enemy advance had stalled. Their attack timeline, originally set for the end of the week, had been postponed indefinitely. Intelligence suggested that the enemy command structure was in chaos and that reinforcements were being requested. Dr. Rodriguez was worried sick about Maria's disappearance, but he was too busy treating patients to mount a serious search effort. He had found her note but couldn't understand what kind of special mission a young nurse might be undertaking. He feared she had been captured or killed while trying to evacuate civilians from outlying areas. The truth was far more extraordinary than anyone could have imagined. By the end of her 4th day in the mountains, Maria had eliminated 12 enemy personnel and destroyed significant amounts of equipment. More importantly, she had transformed a confident, aggressive enemy force into a paranoid defensive unit that was afraid to move during daylight hours. But she also knew that her campaign couldn't continue indefinitely. Eventually, the enemy would adapt to her tactics or bring in specialized counter-sniper units. She needed to plan something decisive, a strike that would either force them to retreat or create an opportunity for the village militia to act. Maria spent that evening studying the enemy positions one final time. She had noticed that despite their increased security, they still maintained certain predictable routines. Supply convoys arrived each morning at approximately the same time. Guard shifts changed at regular intervals. Most telling of all, the replacement commander held briefings in the same location where his predecessor had died. An audacious plan began to form in her mind. It would require perfect timing, exceptional shooting, and considerable luck. But if successful, it might end the siege of San Miguel without further bloodshed. As she cleaned her rifle and prepared for what might be her final mission, Maria thought about the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 months ago, she had been a simple village nurse whose biggest worry was running out of bandages. Now she was a ghost in the mountains, striking fear into the hearts of seasoned soldiers. Her grandfather would have been proud, she decided. He had always said that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but action, in spite of fear. Maria was definitely afraid. Afraid of dying, afraid of failing, afraid of what would happen to her village if she didn't succeed. But tomorrow she would face that fear and attempt something that would either save San Miguel or cost her everything. The Phantom Sniper's greatest challenge lay ahead. Dawn on the fifth day brought ominous news to San Miguel. Enemy scouts had been spotted moving closer to the village perimeter, and radio intercepts suggested that a final assault was being planned. Captain Torres called an emergency meeting in the church, his face grim with the weight of impossible decisions. "They're coming today," he announced to the gathered militiamen and civilians. "Our scouts report movement on all approaches. We estimate they'll attack within 6 hours." The crowd erupted in worried murmurs. Mothers clutched their children closer, while fathers checked their weapons with trembling hands. Everyone knew the odds they faced. "We have 42 men ready to fight," Torres continued. "The enemy has at least 150 soldiers, possibly more. They have machine guns, mortars, and artillery support. If we fight, most of us will die. If we surrender," he didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone had heard the stories from other villages. In the back of the church, Dr. Rodriguez sat alone, his weathered hands folded in prayer. He was still tormented by Maria's disappearance and blamed himself for not stopping her from leaving on whatever dangerous mission she had undertaken. He feared he would never see his surrogate daughter again. High in the mountains above, Maria was making her final preparations. She had observed the enemy's dawn briefing and confirmed her suspicions about their attack plan. They would advance in 3 columns, with the main force moving directly up the valley road, while smaller units attempted to flank the village from both sides. The plan was tactically sound but relied heavily on coordination between the 3 columns. If that coordination could be disrupted at the critical moment, the attack might collapse into chaos. Maria had identified the key communication nodes and timing that would be necessary to create maximum confusion, but her most audacious plan involved something no one would expect: revealing herself at the moment of greatest danger to provide both tactical leadership and inspirational courage to the village defenders. Maria had spent years hiding her true capabilities, playing the role of a gentle nurse while secretly maintaining the skills of a master marksman. Today, she would finally reveal who she really was. She began her descent from the mountains just as the enemy columns started their advance, moving through terrain she knew better than her own home. Maria positioned herself at a rocky outcrop that overlooked the main approach to San Miguel. From here, she could see the entire battlefield and communicate with the village defenders below. The enemy had grown overconfident during their week-long siege. Despite the sniper attacks, they believed they were facing only 1 or 2 skilled marksmen operating from static positions. They had no concept that their opponent was actually a mobile, adaptable fighter who understood both the terrain and their tactical methods better than they understood themselves. As the first enemy column approached the village outskirts, Maria took her initial shot. The bullet struck the column commander, dropping him instantly and causing the advance to falter. But instead of disappearing as she had done previously, Maria immediately shifted position and fired again, eliminating the radio operator who was trying to call for support. Down in San Miguel, the militiamen heard the distinctive crack of a high-powered rifle echoing from the mountains. Captain Torres grabbed his binoculars and scanned the hills, trying to locate the shooter. What he saw made him gasp in amazement. A lone figure was moving along the ridge above the village, firing with mechanical precision at enemy targets. The shooter's position allowed them to observe the entire battlefield and coordinate attacks against all 3 advancing columns simultaneously. "Someone's up there fighting for us," Torres shouted to his men. "They're hitting the enemy commanders and radio operators." The psychological impact on both sides was immediate and dramatic. The village militiamen, who had been preparing for a hopeless last stand, suddenly felt a surge of hope and determination. If someone was willing to risk their life fighting from the mountains, they could find the courage to defend their homes. Conversely, the enemy soldiers found themselves facing an opponent who seemed to be everywhere at once. The mysterious sniper was no longer content to take single shots and disappear. Instead, they were providing continuous supporting fire that disrupted every aspect of the attack. Maria moved through her predetermined positions like a deadly choreographer conducting a symphony of violence. She had memorized every rock, every tree, and every firing angle during her days of reconnaissance. Her grandfather's training in field movement and camouflage allowed her to remain invisible despite being constantly in motion. The first enemy column, deprived of leadership and communication, began to waver. Without clear orders from their commanders, Individual squads made their own decisions about whether to advance or take cover. The coordinated attack dissolved into a series of unrelated skirmishes. Seeing an opportunity, Captain Torres made a crucial decision. Instead of waiting passively for the enemy to reach the village, he led his militia in a counterattack against the confused and leaderless enemy column. The farmers and shopkeepers of San Miguel, inspired by the mysterious mountain fighter, charged forward with surprising ferocity. Maria provided covering fire for the militia advance, picking off enemy machine gunners and anyone who tried to organize a defense. Her shots were perfectly timed to support the villagers' movements, creating openings in the enemy line at exactly the right moments. The second and third enemy columns, hearing the sounds of battle and losing radio contact with their sister unit, hesitated to continue their advance. Their commanders were trained to follow coordinated battle plans, not to improvise responses to unexpected situations. This hesitation proved fatal to their mission. Maria shifted her attention to the flanking columns, using her knowledge of the terrain to move between positions faster than the enemy could track her. She struck at their leadership and communication assets with surgical precision, leaving each unit isolated and confused. Within 2 hours, what should have been an overwhelming enemy victory had turned into a chaotic retreat. The three-column attack had collapsed into a series of isolated firefights, with enemy units withdrawing independently rather than supporting each other. But Maria knew the battle wasn't over. Enemy reinforcements would eventually arrive, and the village militia couldn't maintain their aggressive posture indefinitely. She needed to end this decisively before the enemy could regroup and launch another attack. From her current position, Maria could see the enemy command post in the valley below. The replacement commanders were frantically trying to re-establish contact with their scattered units and call for reinforcements. If she could eliminate their ability to coordinate a response, the entire enemy force might be compelled to retreat. The distance was extreme, nearly 1,000 meters, and the target was partially concealed behind defensive barriers. It would require the most difficult shot of her life, made under combat conditions with multiple variables affecting accuracy. Maria steadied her rifle and controlled her breathing. Through the scope, she could see 2 officers huddled over a radio, trying to coordinate their scattered forces. One shot could eliminate both targets and destroy their primary communication equipment. She thought about her grandfather's words about courage and duty. She thought about Dr. Rodriguez teaching her to heal rather than harm. She thought about the children of San Miguel who deserve to grow up in freedom. The rifle barked and both enemy officers crumpled to the ground. The radio exploded in a shower of sparks and smoke. Within minutes, the retreat began. Without leadership or communication, the surviving enemy units began withdrawing toward their original positions. What had started as an organized assault had become a panicked flight. Captain Torres, watching the enemy retreat through his binoculars, realized that their mysterious ally had single-handedly turned the tide of battle. He ordered his men to pursue the withdrawing enemy, but to maintain caution in case this was some kind of tactical deception. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the valley, it became clear that the enemy was truly retreating. Scout reports confirmed that they were abandoning their positions and moving away from San Miguel entirely. But the greatest revelation was yet to come. As the militia returned to the village in triumph, they saw a lone figure walking down the mountain path toward town. The person moved with the confident gait of someone who had just accomplished an impossible mission. Dr. Rodriguez, who had been treating wounded militiamen in the makeshift hospital, looked up to see a familiar silhouette approaching the building. His heart nearly stopped when he recognized the figure. Maria Santos walked through the hospital door carrying her grandfather's rifle, her nurse's uniform dusty from 5 days in the mountains, her eyes carrying the weight of what she had done. "Maria!" Dr. Rodriguez cried, rushing to embrace her. "Where have you been? We thought you were dead." She smiled wearily and set down her weapon. "I've been protecting our home, doctor, just like you taught me to protect our patients." Word spread quickly through the village. The mysterious mountain sniper who had saved San Miguel was none other than their own gentle nurse. People gathered outside the hospital to catch a glimpse of the young woman who had accomplished what seemed impossible. Captain Torres arrived with his senior militiamen, their faces showing a mixture of amazement and gratitude. "Was that really you up there?" he asked. Maria nodded simply. My grandfather taught me to shoot when I was a child. I've been practicing ever since, just in case our village ever needed protection. The crowd outside began to cheer as the story spread. Children who had received care from Maria's gentle hands could hardly believe she was the same person who had terrorized an entire enemy army. Parents whose sons had returned safely from the battle wanted to thank her personally, but Maria seemed uncomfortable with the attention. She had always been a private person who preferred helping others from the shadows. The role of public hero felt strange and overwhelming. Dr. Rodriguez, understanding her nature better than anyone, quietly led her away from the crowd to his private office. There, surrounded by medical books and bottles of medicine, Maria finally allowed herself to show the emotional toll of her actions. "I had to do it," she said quietly. There was no other way to save everyone. The doctor nodded, recognizing that his gentle assistant had been forced to become something else entirely by the circumstances of war. "You saved us all, Maria. Your grandfather would have been proud." Over the following days, as the village celebrated their unexpected victory, Maria gradually returned to her normal duties as a nurse. She treated the wounded militiamen with the same gentle care she had always shown, as if nothing had changed. But something fundamental had shifted in how people saw her. The young woman who had once been simply the village nurse was now also Maria Santos, the phantom sniper who had defeated an entire enemy army through courage, skill, and determination. Enemy forces never returned to threaten San Miguel. Word of their defeat spread through military channels, creating a legend about the mountain village defended by a ghost who could strike from impossible distances. The story grew with each telling, but those who lived through it knew the truth was even more remarkable than the legend. Maria kept her grandfather's rifle, but she hoped never to need it again. She had learned that sometimes gentle people must become warriors to protect what they love, but she preferred her original calling as a healer. When people asked her about those 5 days in the mountains, she would simply say that everyone has hidden strengths that emerge when they're needed most. She had been a nurse who learned to be a sniper, but in her heart she remained someone who preferred to save lives rather than take them. The phantom sniper had revealed herself to be exactly who she had always been, Maria Santos, protector of her people, whether through healing hands or deadly accurate aim. In the end, both roles served the same purpose: keeping the people of San Miguel safe and free.